we are joined from Seville by Mr. Maher Nicolas Firzli, the director of the EU Asian Centre, and from Doha by Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, the executive director of the Global Foreign Policy Centre. Gentlemen, welcome to Think Tank. Mr. Russell, I'll start off with you first. Now, in his second term, Trump has repeatedly voiced concerns about Europe. Does this new document officially lay bare those frustrations?
Well, it's good to be with you, Haney, as always. I mean, basically, yes. I mean, this is completely a huge reverse on what has made U.S. a very dominant strategic partner in many parts of the world. What Donald Trump's national security strategy does is basically give America first and put it in hyperdrive. It doesn't take into consideration the necessity of having soft power. It completely decimates any sort of touchstone with the Baker Doctrine, which one would argue that was probably our strongest point, where U.S. had influence on a global scale, and it pretty much contradicts a lot of Trump's policies by saying, like he's a president of peace, but we're going to get more active here in the Western Hemisphere, a la Venezuela. And, it's whatever it is I say it is. And there's no clarity to this strategy.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Firzli, this document, it's much more than just a policy adjustment, isn't it? I mean, is Trump actually burning the bridges of the post-war alliance?
I'm delighted to join you today from Seville Airport, and I apologize for the noise. I would be less harsh on Trump. So basically, of course, if you read that document published by the national security apparatus of the White House 4 days ago, it is a disaster for both the European Union and NATO, and you can add to that Britain. So the UK, the EU, and NATO, for them, it's a big shock. But it's a shock not as much because Trump is bad or evil or whatever. It's a shock because they lived in a denial of reality. And I would use another term. I think for them, that publication creates some kind of mental cognitive dissonance. Why am I using the word cognitive dissonance? Because the elites today in Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and London, who are they? They are admirers, really admirers and disciples of George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Tony Blair. They have nothing to do with Jim Baker, by the way. I quite like Jim Baker. And I think, it's a long debate, but Jim Baker is closer to Trump than to the European foreign policy elites. But it's another debate. What I'm coming at, the elite today in Europe, they are liberal hawks and neocons. And these ideas, the sort of center-left, pro-NATO, liberal hawkish stance, and the right-wing Bush-Cheney brand of fascism, neoconservatism, these ideas were born in Washington, D.C., and they were exported to Europe 20, 30 years ago. So by a cruel irony, what people like von der Leyen and Macron are doing, they're clinging desperately to the old dominant ideology, which America had in the sort of Bush, Cheney, Obama, Clinton, Biden era. And now that ideology is dead. Why is it dead? Very quickly, because the second Trump presidency is very different from the first one. Why? Because 8 years ago, when Trump was elected for the first time, the Republican elite, the majority of MPs, congressmen, senators, they were either country club Republicans or neoconservatives in the mold of Bush and Cheney. What Trump has done in the past 8 years, he has completely decimated the old Republican neocon establishment in Washington, D.C. So now he can really be Trump. What does it mean to be Trump? Yes, it means neo-Nixonian, neo-Nixonian, brutal realism, yes. It means being selfish, yes. But why is he doing so? Not because he's evil or he wants to hurt Europe. No, he's doing so because there's a bigger issue now, which is the technological industrial race with China. And Trump and other people around him, they understood that the neoconservative, neoliberal, Clinton, Bush policy mix was a disaster for America. because it allowed China to grow, to steal away market share. It allowed Europeans to profit from the American military umbrella without putting a dime. So America was exploited in the past 40 years, and the imbeciles, the idiots, were people like Bush or Cheney, or Hillary Clinton, thinking they could export, they could export Jeffersonian democracy to Tikrit, Mosul, and Kandahar. The exporting, quote unquote, of Jeffersonian democracy to Kandahar and Tikrit was a disaster for America. It cost American trillions in taxpayers' money. It killed thousands of American, servicemen. And so Trump, yes, he's selfish because the pendulum is swinging in the complete opposite way, which is, a form of neo-Nixonian selfishness, which is good for America.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Russell, it seems Mr. Firzli is not really surprised by what this document stated, but Mr. Russell, now the document urges also Europe to take primary responsibility for its own defense. Now, what does the US expect Europe to do immediately? It already forced Europe or European countries to spend about 5% of their GDP on defense. So what more does the US expect from European countries?
Well, I think that there's an expectation, written or unwritten, in this document that says when they use the terms cultural erasure, they're saying, hey, you got to stop bringing in outsiders into your country because eventually they get visa-free passage over here and they become our problem eventually, which is not something that, it's not reality. That's very unrealistic is what they're talking about. So what they're saying is, you guys close your borders, we're closing our borders. It's on you. If Russia wants to get a little frisky there in the east, well, you know what? We'll be back there going rah rah, but it's not really our problem. And yet, and this is the thing about this strategy, and it was done. It almost seems like in a crazy vacuum. Is in one part of this, when they're talking about Europe, they're saying you need to defend yourselves, you need to defend yourselves. And then yet at another point, they start talking about, well, we got to do more trade, we got to break this deficit. You can't play both sides. And that's where, with all due respect to my colleague, you talk about the country club Republicans. Look, if you think that Reagan wasn't part of that Bush, Cheney, 41-43 mindset, then you're missing out on history. Reagan pretty much set this. It was Reagan that had George Bush as his Secretary of State. This is what the Baker Doctrine was designed to do. And when we started getting away from the Baker Doctrine, I would go back as far as saying even during Obama, but particularly in Trump, his first administration, and even in certain instances, Biden, when we started getting away from the ideals that Jim Baker had put into place and putting emphasis on soft power works. What Donald Trump is trying to do is to have a little bit of soft power, a little bit of carrot and stick, but at the same time contradicting himself. Again, I go back to, I'm the president of peace, and yet he's talking about escalation and war fighting, and it just doesn't make sense. There's no continuity. And what this does, and here's the danger, is we're seeing the rise of like BRICS, the SCO. I mean, heck, BRICS is talking about coming up with their own currency. If that is the case, what we're starting to see is the results of Donald Trump's failed policies, de-dollarizing the global economy, which if we think it's bad now, and let's remind ourselves, Donald Trump currently has a 28% approval rating when it comes to his handling of the country here in the United States. There's a bigger problem, is we are driving our allies into the hands of our adversaries because they don't have the tariffs or the go to the back of the bus mentality that Donald Trump is trying to use. The reality is he's living in a dream world, and this could be very dangerous, both economically and on a security level that we've never seen before.
Mr. Firzli, the The strategy contains a highly charged language, the term including the prospect of civilizational erasure. How does the European Union formally respond to this political accusation that challenges the fundamental identity of the European project?
So here, I want to say just a caveat. I partly agree with what Justin said, only partly, but I want to make one remark because he spoke about Reagan and history. Actually, George Bush Sr. and Jim Baker, I quite like their policy mix, which I would call, moderate Nixonian or Nixonian centrist. But the world of George Bush Sr. and James Baker, their world died in the year 1992. So their policies have been repudiated. The kind of centrist Republican soft power. Yes, it's great. Yes, it works. But the Republicans themselves, they have abandoned that centrist soft power in the year 1992, and everything which followed, including the Clintons, Bush Jr., and Dick Cheney, was not country club centrism. It was warmongering. It was neocon warmongering, and that was a disaster for America. But back to your question, yes, that was provocative. So that particular page in the national security, the U.S. national security project, that page, hinting that Europe was led by quote unquote, moral degenerates, blah, blah, blah. That was maybe a little too much. There is a kernel of truth in it, of course, but it's too much. The wording is harsh. And they've used the wording from a right-wing, ultra-conservative French philosopher who came up 25 years ago with a theory called le grand remplacement, the great replacement. And that theory in French political science, the great replacement, the fear from migration, submerging the West and destroying the West, that was and still is to some extent a fringe idea amongst most center-right European conservative party. But what happened in America 4 or 5 years ago, what you may call the nativist, the nativist ultra-nationalist wing of the Republican Party, one of the components of the Trump coalition, they absorb that right-wing French idea of the great replacement, and it helps inform the radical, sort of anti-immigrant stance they have in America. After all, one could argue that U.S. voters voted for that, and American voters are getting what they voted for. What's a little bit osé, excuse my French, is now America or the White House seems to tell the Europeans, we know what's good for you. You should be careful, you Europeans, because you are going to be submerged, blah, blah, blah. And one could argue it's not America's business to do so. Let the Europeans, figure out what is good for them. And according to opinion polls in France, for example, or even in the UK, so according to recent opinion polls in the UK and France, 50 or 60% of French and UK voters are willing today to vote for the far right. The kind of far right, Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage, who also believes in the great replacement theory. What I'm coming at is this is a UK issue, a French issue. Let voters in Europe decide about their own fate.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Russell, what is the practical meaning of reviving the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century? How will the US respond to renewed non-military European influence in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, I mean, that's actually a really good question. And I don't know if I have a real answer to it because here's the thing is, a lot of this administration are invoking terms like the Monroe Doctrine. We're starting to hear about the Trump corollary. And the reality is, I don't think they truly understand what the Monroe Doctrine truly was and is. It's the expansion. Basically, the Monroe Doctrine is basically the use of American thought leadership, American economic leadership, American industrial leadership, understanding the fact that industrial wasn't really a thing when Monroe was in play, But when we talk about the Monroe Doctrine, that's the baseline for soft power. Monroe Doctrine says, look, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to expand our alliances. We're going to expand our cooperation. We're even going to expand our sphere of influence. We're going to expand that in a way that is mutually beneficial to both parties, where we can both grow economically, we can both maintain security. And yet we start hearing about, and we read in this national security strategy that was published the other day, about how the U.S. is going to go back to greatness when it comes to its industrial base, its ability to export goods and manufacture. What nobody's telling and nobody's talking about in the administration is the fact that the reality is we don't have the infrastructure to do that. We don't have the workforce to do that. And quite frankly, as long as we are continuing to kind of make our enemies, I mean, heck, we're having a fight right now with Canada and Mexico. Donald Trump can go to the FIFA pick and selection party at the Kennedy Center all day long. The reality is there's tension there. Why? Because of Donald Trump's tariffs and his foreign policy. The America First doesn't work. It is great if we can say America is the best partner to have. America is your best friend. But if you can't trust the U.S. to work with your people and put out crazy tariffs, then what that does is that eliminates any sort of possibility of there being any sort of Monroe Doctrine or Trump corollary, because we're not going to have any friends that are going to want to deal with us on a good faith level because we don't have any street credibility. That's a problem.
Well, Mr. Firzli, Germany's foreign minister said that Europe doesn't need outside advice, and that was actually a quick reaction from the German foreign minister. Do you see the US-European Union relationship entering a more confrontational phase?
Yes and no. Yes and no, because I will once again disagree respectfully with Justin. I think the balance of power is clearly in America's hand, right? So it's not like the EU and the US are equals, right? What happened, and here I think Justin is wrong. What happened on the 29th of July that year? Ursula von der Leyen went to Scotland, and she didn't go to Scotland to a government building. She went to a country club in Scotland named after Trump's grandmother. And she completely submitted to Trump. She agreed to that 15% tariff, but there's something much more important. She agreed, and speaking in the name, by the way, of German, Italian, and French private sector industries. She agreed, she told to Trump, yes, I vouch for the private sector in Milan, Paris, and Berlin, and Frankfurt, and I agree that in the coming 5 years, German, Italian, and French industrial companies will invest tens of billions of dollars every year in new factories in Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Tennessee. That is horrible, and the Europeans agreed to that. South Korea is a much more successful economy than Europe. Switzerland is a much more successful industrial economy than Europe. In many ways, Switzerland and South Korea are the two most successful success stories in the world economy today. What did the Swiss and the South Koreans agree to? They also agreed in the next 3-4 years, most big Swiss and South Korean industrial companies, including LG and Siemens, etc., they will build microchip factories, renewable energy factories, cars, pharmaceutical factories, and they have started already, by the way. They will build them in America, not in Switzerland or South Korea. So what I'm coming at, Trump may be clumsy, maybe harsh, maybe not a very polite person, maybe, but he's already reaping the fruit of his policies. His policy is very simple. He wants to reindustrialize America. You cannot reindustrialize America by being nice and gentle. And by the way, Justin is wrong about Monroe. Monroe did not believe in soft power at all, because Monroe believed in what he called the big stick. So if you believe in the big stick, it's the complete opposite. And he believed, Monroe, that America aggressively, using military force, should kick out the Spanish and the English and the French from South America. This is Monroe's doctrine, the big stick, not a gentle, soft power policy. So I'm afraid that, you could say that the real follower of the Monroe doctrine today is Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Russell, in your view, what would restore confidence then between Washington and European capitals? Or is there confidence to be restored in the first place? Because as Mr. Firzli mentioned, the US is being much more industrialized, with many of the heavyweights of the private sector in European countries, including Switzerland as well, and South Korea, are opening their factories in the US.
So here's the thing, is they've been doing that for decades. Volkswagen has had a major manufacturing plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Honda in South Carolina, BMW, Audi, they're all doing that. Even some of the large, even two of the companies that the good doctor talked about, Siemens has manufacturing capabilities here. Everybody does. But the reality is we just don't have the capacity. And by the way, they can commit to anything. If I was the CEO of a major European company, I could tell Trump, yeah, you know what? I'll build 5 factories anywhere you want me to put them. Tell me where to put them. And you want to know what's going to happen is Trump's not going to be in office. And what do the CEOs of these companies realize? That even if they wanted to build a factory and reindustrial and be part of the reindustrial revolution of the United States, it's going to take them 10 years to be able to establish from day one any sort of real, true industrial ability. There's another thing I want to point out, too, is, again, all due respect to the good doctor, where you've got to look at this from a bilateral aspect, is we're getting to the point where, we're going to be America first, everybody wants to deal with us. But what we're starting to see is, like, for example, we started seeing this in Ukraine, where the arms going back and forth. Let's say companies like Rheinmetall, let's say that companies like BAE, Airbus, they start building stuff. And then what happens? They start relying on their own building. I mean, Saab even is building planes for the Ukrainians. They stop buying U.S. products. And then what happens is we see tens of thousands of jobs go away because nobody's buying our defense products. That could be anything. That goes with cars. We saw this during the Japanese car boom here in the United States. You go to any major country right now, you're seeing less and less U.S. car dealerships and more European and Chinese car dealerships. That's going to cause unemployment, and that's the fallacy of Trump's plan, even at a national security strategy level.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, the Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center, and Mr. Maher Nicolas Firzli, the Director of the EU ASEAN Center. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on Think Tank.